Can you believe a black teenager with no legal experience could outsmart a veteran attorney and a stern judge? Stick around to see this extraordinary tale unfold, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more uplifting stories like this. Now, let's dive into Cale Draven's heartfelt battle for justice. The courtroom buzzed with faint murmurs and the occasional shuffle of papers. A stark, clinical light flooded the space, reflecting off the gleaming wooden benches and casting deep shadows across the faces of those present. Every seat was taken, every gaze locked on the center stage where a showdown was about to begin. Perched high on his bench was Judge Hadrian Voss, a man known far and wide for his rigid demeanor and piercing rulings. His cold stare and unwavering presence often left those in his court fumbling to keep their cool. He surveyed the room, his face as stern as the gavel he gripped. Suddenly, the heavy courtroom doors groaned open, silencing the whispers. All heads turned as a teenager stepped inside. Cale Draven, a 17-year-old black boy, clutched a battered briefcase in one hand while the other nervously tugged at an oversized blazer draped awkwardly over his lean frame. His sneakers squeaked faintly against the polished floor as he approached the defense table. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, not just of curiosity, but of subtle scorn. Some onlookers exchanged smug glances. Others muttered under their breath, "What's he doing here?" Judge Voss arched an eyebrow, his lips curling into a slight, mocking grin. "This isn't the playground," he remarked, his voice slicing through the quiet. "Are you sure you're not lost on your way to a game?" The room broke into soft chuckles, spearheaded by Gideon Pierce, the opposing attorney, whose smirk oozed dismissal. But Cale didn't waver. He paused, squared his shoulders, and met the judge's gaze. His voice, though youthful, rang clear and resolute. "No, Your Honor," he said. "I'm here to defend my mother." The courtroom fell hushed, every eye fixed on Cale. For a moment, time seemed to freeze, the gravity of his words settling over the room. Cale hadn't always been this fearless. To understand why he stood here now, you have to look back at the hardships he and his mother, Mara Draven, had faced, the struggles that brought them to this pivotal moment. Cale lived with Mara in a neighborhood time seemed to have overlooked. The streets were splintered, the houses worn and slumping against each other, as if they, too, carried the burdens of those inside. Life was tough for families like theirs, especially for a black woman raising a son alone. Mara worked tirelessly as a janitor, picking up extra hours whenever she could to cobble together enough for rent and groceries. Despite the challenges, she'd always turned their small, weathered home into a sanctuary. It wasn't much, just a handful of rooms with chipped paint and a dripping faucet, but it was alive with warmth, laughter, and the promise of a brighter tomorrow. She urged Cale to study hard, repeating daily that education was his ticket out of poverty's grip. One afternoon, as Mara trudged home after another exhausting shift, she spotted a folded paper tucked under their door. Wiping sweat from her forehead, she picked it up and opened it. Her face dropped. It was an eviction notice, its cold, printed words unrelenting. "They're saying I owe back rent," she murmured, her voice shaky. "But I've paid. I know I've paid." Cale, seated at the kitchen table with his textbooks, sensed trouble instantly. He stood, took the paper from her hands, and scanned it closely. The more he read, the more his brow creased. "Mom, this doesn't add up," he said firmly. "Something's off here." Mara sighed wearily, sinking into a chair, her trembling hands struggling to steady themselves. "You don't get it, Cale," she whispered. "People like us, we don't win. They'll take it all, no matter what we do." Cale watched her, his heart aching. His mother, the strongest person he knew, looked crushed. Her words hung heavy, steeped in defeat. But for Cale, they didn't just signal despair. They sparked something fierce within him. He gripped the paper tightly, resolve flaring in his eyes. If no one else would stand up for their family, he would. He didn't know how, but he was certain of one thing. He wouldn't let their home slip away without a fight. Mara's words lingered in Cale's mind as night fell. He sat silently at the kitchen table, the eviction notice still in his grasp, while the sound of his mother's slow footsteps echoed faintly through their tiny home. He couldn't erase the image of her earlier, her hands shaking, her voice cracking. She'd always been his anchor, working endlessly for his future. Now she seemed broken, resigned to an unjust fate. Later that evening, as Mara stared blankly at the faded wallpaper from the couch, Cale approached her. "Mom," he said softly, sitting beside her. "We can't just let this happen. You've done everything for me. Now it's my turn to do something for you." Mara shook her head, her voice thick with exhaustion and doubt. "Cale, you're just a boy. This is bigger than us. They've got lawyers, contracts, power. We can't fight them. But what if we can?" Cale pressed, his voice quivering but resolute. "What if they're wrong? That notice doesn't make sense. There's got to be something we can do." Mara sighed deeply, tears pooling in her eyes. "Even if we could afford a lawyer, Cale, it wouldn't matter. People like the landlord, they always win. You can't fight the system." Cale leaned forward, hands gripping his knees. "Mom, I know we don't have money for a lawyer, but what if I did it? What if I represented you?" Mara stared at him, stunned. "Cale, that's impossible," she said, her voice breaking. "You've never studied law. You don't know how to." "I can learn," Cale cut in, his tone steady now. "You've always told me to work hard, to never give up. Isn't that what you've done your whole life? I can't just sit here and watch them take everything. I have to try." For a long moment, the room was quiet except for the hum of the old fridge. Mara studied her son, his face a blend of determination and fear, and saw a strength she'd thought was lost. She reached out, placing her hand over his. "Cale," she whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. "If you think you can do this, I'll stand with you. Always." Cale nodded, his heart racing. He didn't know where to begin, but he knew he had to start somewhere. That night, as Mara slept, Cale opened his laptop and began searching. Terms like tenant rights, eviction laws, and legal defenses filled the screen. The legal world was daunting, but Cale pressed on, driven by love for his mother and a desperate need to save their home. The days that followed were a blur of sleepless nights and relentless effort. Every evening, he cleared the kitchen table, now littered with borrowed law books, printouts, and his meticulous handwritten notes. The flickering kitchen light cast shadows across his face, but Cale barely noticed, his eyes glued to the pages, his mind racing to decode the law's dense language. Mara often watched silently from the doorway, her heart torn between pride and worry. She wanted to help, but all she could offer was quiet support. One evening, she lingered longer, her gaze fixed on her son. His shoulders slumped with exhaustion, yet an unyielding drive pushed him forward. "Cale," she said softly but firmly, "you don't have to do this alone. You've done so much already." Cale looked up, eyes weary but resolute. "Mom, if I don't, who will? They're counting on us giving up. But we won't. Not this time." Late one night, as Cale pored over a housing rights guide, a phrase leaped out. All eviction notices must be notarized by a valid, practicing notary public to be legally enforceable. His heart skipped. He grabbed the eviction notice pinned to the wall and examined it. There it was, a scribbled signature at the bottom, but something felt off. He typed the notary's name into his laptop, fingers shaking with urgency. After an hour of digging, he found it. The notary listed had retired 2 years before the notice was issued. Cale's pulse quickened as the truth hit. This wasn't a mistake. It was fraud, plain and simple. Leaning back in his chair, he stared at the document, his mind buzzing. Exhaustion faded, replaced by a surge of adrenaline. This could be their breakthrough, but he'd have to prepare harder than ever. The landlord's lawyer would try to tear him apart, and he couldn't afford to slip. The following days were consumed with preparation. Cale turned their small living room into a mock courtroom, practicing arguments in front of a mirror, anticipating every question the opposing lawyer might hurl his way. With each session, his voice grew bolder, his words sharper. He didn't just want to know the law, he wanted to master it. Mara would occasionally peek in, a faint smile tugging at her lips as she watched him rehearse. One evening, as he flipped through his notes, she sat beside him and rested a gentle hand on his. "Cale," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "no matter what happens, I'm proud of you. You've already done more than I ever thought possible." Cale's expression softened. "Mom, I'm not just doing this for us. If we let them get away with this, they'll do it to someone else. I can't let that happen." The night before the hearing, Cale stayed up late, reviewing every detail one last time. The kitchen table was covered with neatly arranged documents, his oversized blazer draped over a chair. Mara entered quietly, placing a plate of food beside him. "You need to eat, Cale," she said gently. He gave her a small, grateful smile. "Thanks, Mom," he replied. But he didn't touch the food, returning instead to his notes, flipping pages with practiced precision. As Mara watched, her chest tightened with pride and fear. She knew the odds were against them, but for the first time in weeks, a flicker of hope stirred within her. "Get some rest," she said softly. "You've done everything you can." Cale looked up, eyes unwavering. "Not yet," he said. "Just a little more." The next morning, Cale stood before the courthouse, clutching his binder tightly. His oversized blazer still didn't fit quite right, but the fire in his eyes outshone everything else. It was time to confront the system head-on. The room fell silent as Cale Draven stood at the defendant's table, gripping his binder firmly. The oversized blazer hung loosely on his slim frame, but his stance was steady, his gaze unflinching. The weight of the moment pressed down, yet he pushed forward. "Your Honor," Cale began, his voice steady despite the room's scrutiny. "Today, I'm here to prove that my family's eviction was not only unfair but illegal. I'll present evidence showing the landlord acted improperly, causing harm that could have been avoided." Judge Voss raised an eyebrow, his expression dubious, his sharp eyes boring into Cale as if challenging him to prove his case. Before Cale could continue, Gideon Pierce leaned back in his chair, his smirk audible. "Well, isn't this fascinating?" Pierce said loudly, drawing amused glances from the gallery. "Tell me, young man, where'd you pick this up? A quick YouTube tutorial? Or maybe a how to be a lawyer in 5 steps Google search last night?" The courtroom burst into scattered laughter, but Cale didn't flinch. He paused, took a deep breath, and locked eyes with Pierce. "I didn't learn this from YouTube," Cale replied, calm but firm. "I learned it by studying the laws meant to protect us all. And if you'll let me, I'll show this court how they apply here." Pierce's smirk faltered slightly, and Judge Voss leaned forward, intrigued despite himself. "Proceed," the judge said, his tone neutral but his curiosity clear. Cale opened his binder, his hands steady now, and began outlining the events leading to his family's eviction. His words were deliberate, his evidence carefully organized. Though his path had been riddled with uncertainty, in this moment, his resolve shone through. As Cale spoke, his voice growing more confident, his mind flashed briefly to the long nights that had led him here. He recalled the night he'd found it, a single detail that changed everything. The eviction notice, with its questionable notary signature, had hung on the wall for weeks, nagging at him. One evening, while sifting through housing laws, he'd stumbled on the rule. Eviction notices must be notarized by a practicing notary public. His heart raced as he grabbed the document, cross-referencing it with online records. There it was, the notary had retired 2 years before the notice was issued. Cale leaned back, mind reeling with relief and disbelief. He'd found their key evidence, but he knew it wouldn't hold unless he built a rock-solid case around it. That moment had cemented his determination. Later that night, Mara had stepped into the kitchen, watching as Cale scribbled notes furiously into his binder. She placed a hand on his shoulder. "Cale," she said softly, "I'm proud of you, but you don't have to do this alone." Cale looked up, eyes steady despite his fatigue. "Mom, I have to. If I don't, who will?" Her eyes brimmed with tears, but she nodded. "Then show them what you've got," she whispered. Now, standing in the courtroom, Cale realized every sleepless hour, every note, every doubt had brought him here. He faced Gideon Pierce, his confidence unshaken. The courtroom was quiet except for the faint rustle of papers and the occasional cough. Cale Draven stood firm at the defense table, his binder open before him. Despite the oversized blazer and the seasoned pros around him, his poise demanded attention. His steady voice and methodical delivery had made the room take notice. But Gideon Pierce, the landlord's cocksure attorney, wasn't about to let a teenager steal the show. Pierce rose slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his crisp suit, his every move dripping with practiced authority. A sharp contrast to Cale's youthful vigor. Stepping deliberately toward the courtroom's center, he addressed the judge but aimed his words squarely at Cale. "Well, Mr. Draven," Pierce began, his tone thick with condescension. "That was quite an impressive little speech for someone with, zero legal training? Truly commendable." He chuckled lightly, the sound bouncing off the walls. A few spectators smirked, and a faint ripple of amusement spread through the gallery. Pierce clasped his hands behind his back, pacing slowly. "But let's see how well you really grasp the law you're so boldly citing." He flipped open a hefty legal tome from his table stack. Section 45 of the Landlord-Tenant Act, he boomed with mock authority, clearly states that a landlord may issue an eviction notice if the tenant fails to meet payment obligations for 2 consecutive months. "Now, Mr. Draven, are you denying your mother was behind on rent?" The room held its breath as all eyes turned to Cale. He paused, his mind racing to dissect the question. He saw Pierce's strategy: flood him with legal noise and nudge him toward a damaging admission. Cale inhaled deeply, steadying himself, and met Pierce's sharp gaze with his own calm stare. "No, Mr. Pierce," he began firmly. "I'm not here to deny payments were delayed, but I am here to prove that this eviction notice," he held up the document for all to see, "was issued fraudulently. The signature at the bottom belongs to a notary who retired 2 years before this was dated. That makes it invalid, regardless of payment status." A murmur swept through the gallery, some spectators leaning forward to glimpse the document Cale held. Pierce's confident grin flickered briefly, his eyes darting to the paper before snapping back to Cale, a hint of doubt breaking through. He recovered fast, clearing his throat and flipping to another page. But Section 52 of the same act," Pierce said, his tone edgier now, "states that procedural errors, like clerical mistakes, don't stop an eviction if the tenants failed their financial duties." Cale didn't hesitate. He glanced at the judge, then back at Pierce. "That's correct," he said steadily, "but only if the tenant's been given a valid notice first. This notice is fraudulent. The law's clear. Invalid documents void the entire eviction process. Surely a seasoned lawyer like you knows that." For a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath. Pierce's mask of confidence cracked again, more noticeably this time. His jaw tightened, and he rifled through his notes with a hint of frustration. Whispers of approval spread through the gallery, heads nodding, murmurs of admiration rising. Even Judge Voss, who'd been leaning back with an air of detachment, sat forward slightly, his keen eyes locked on Cale, a spark of curiosity and respect glinting within them. Pierce cleared his throat, forcing a tight smile. "Well, Mr. Draven," he said, "you're certainly thorough, but this case is far from over." He returned to his seat, his face a mix of irritation and grudging respect. Cale exhaled quietly, tightening his grip on his binder. He'd met the first challenge, but the fight was just heating up. The courtroom was hushed, save for the soft shuffle of papers and the hum of overhead lights. Cale Draven stood behind the defense table, his binder open, taking a deep breath to steady himself as he gripped the table's edges. This was his moment to shift the tide. "Your Honor," Cale began, his voice even and deliberate, "this is the eviction notice issued to my mother by the landlord. It might look legitimate at first glance, but there's a critical flaw." He stepped forward, holding up the paper for the judge and gallery to see. At the bottom is a notarized signature from Elsie Varn. However, Elsie Varn retired as a notary public 2 years before this document was issued. This isn't just an error, it's intentional fraud. A murmur rippled through the gallery as Cale's words took root. He pressed on, undeterred by the mounting tension. Under state law, any eviction notice tied to a fraudulent signature is invalid. Without a valid notice, the whole eviction process is unlawful. Judge Voss leaned forward slightly, his expression keen as he watched the document being passed to the court clerk for review. Cale reached into his binder and pulled out another paper. "This," he said, holding it aloft, "is an official record of Elsie Varn's notary certification, clearly showing her retirement date, 2 years before this notice. I've also included her state-filed retirement paperwork to verify this evidence." Gideon Pierce, seated at the landlord's table, shifted uneasily. His usual smug grin wavered as his eyes flicked between Cale and the document now under scrutiny. "Your Honor," Pierce interjected, his voice edged with irritation. "This is an outrageous claim. How does this kid even get such information?" Cale turned to Pierce, his gaze steady and tone calm. "I did my research, Mr. Pierce. The law's open to anyone willing to study it." Pierce's jaw clenched as he flipped through his notes, hunting for a rebuttal. "Even if this were true," he said, his voice rising, "the tenant still failed to meet financial obligations. The notice is secondary." Cale didn't let him finish. "The law doesn't see it that way, Mr. Pierce," he said firmly. "State law demands a valid notice before any eviction can proceed. A fraudulent document voids the process entirely. Surely, as a seasoned lawyer, you're aware of this." The room went silent. The gallery, once buzzing with whispers and stifled laughs, now sat rapt, waiting. Even Judge Voss seemed captivated, his eyes narrowing as he reviewed the evidence. "Mr. Draven," the judge said at last, his voice measured but firm, "these are serious accusations. If this evidence holds, it could fundamentally change this case's direction. The court will take a brief recess to verify the documents." With a sharp rap of his gavel, Judge Voss rose and left the room. Cale exhaled softly, his shoulders easing as the room's tension shifted. He glanced back at Mara, seated a few rows behind him. Her eyes shone with pride as she gave him a small nod, her quiet encouragement grounding him. The courtroom reconvened, the air thick with anticipation. Judge Voss returned to the bench, his face unreadable as he adjusted his glasses and sifted through Cale's submitted documents. After a pause, he looked up, fixing his piercing gaze on the teenager at the defense table. "Mr. Draven," the judge began, his tone steady but authoritative, "the evidence you've presented is compelling, but as you must know, presenting evidence is only part of it. The law is intricate, and interpreting it correctly is key. I have questions to ensure you fully understand your claim's weight." Cale nodded, his expression calm but focused. "I understand, Your Honor. Please go ahead." The judge leaned forward, fingers laced. "Let's start here. You've claimed the eviction notice is invalid due to fraud. Under what statute or precedent do you base this?" Without hesitation, Cale replied, "Your Honor, I'm relying on Section 58 of the State Tenant Protection Act, which states eviction notices must be signed by a certified notary at the time of issuance. Any notice with an invalid or fraudulent signature is void, as upheld in State v. Carver from 2008. Judge Voss raised an eyebrow, faintly impressed. "And what about the landlord's argument that procedural errors don't invalidate an eviction if the tenant hasn't paid? How do you address that?" Cale paused briefly, choosing his words carefully. "Your Honor, that's covered in Fenton v. Wells from 2011. The court ruled that while tenants must pay rent, landlords must follow proper legal steps. Failing to issue a valid notice is a procedural flaw that can't be ignored, regardless of payment status." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Are you aware, Mr. Draven, that if your argument holds, it could set a precedent affecting landlord-tenant disputes statewide? How would you handle the potential backlash or misuse of such a ruling?" Cale straightened, his voice firm yet respectful. "Your Honor, I believe the law should apply equally to everyone. If my argument sets a precedent, it's because the system currently has gaps that hurt people like my family, those without means to fight back. If landlords must obey the law, no one, no matter how powerful, should be exempt. Judge Voss leaned back, tapping his pen against the desk. After a long pause, he spoke. Mr. Draven, I've seen seasoned attorneys falter on questions like these, but you've shown preparation and insight that rivals professionals here. It's remarkable, truly. The room stayed silent, the judge's words sinking in. The courtroom was utterly still as Judge Voss leaned back, his pen tapping lightly against the desk. For the first time, his stern gaze softened, shifting from doubt to something like admiration. He adjusted his glasses, studying Cale Draven as if seeing him anew. Mr. Draven, the judge began, his voice clear and steady. You've presented your case with clarity, precision, and a grasp of the law beyond my expectations. I'll admit, when you first stepped in here, I underestimated you. But today, you've reminded me of a core truth. Justice doesn't care about age, race, or background. It thrives on truth and courage, and you've shown both. The words reverberated through the room. The gallery, once rife with skepticism and quiet laughs, fell silent. Heads nodded. A man in the second row, who'd chuckled earlier, leaned forward, his face serious. Maybe I got him wrong, he whispered to his neighbor. Nearby, an elderly woman dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief, murmuring, That boy's got more honor than most men I've known. The ripple of approval grew, turning into hushed agreement. Those who dismissed Cale now sat in quiet awe, reflecting on the stunning shift they'd witnessed. Even Gideon Pierce, the landlord's once assured attorney, sat rigid, hands clenched, his expression a mix of frustration and reluctant respect, avoiding the eyes around him. Cale stood at the defense table, fingers resting lightly on his binder. The room's judgment no longer felt heavy, it felt affirming. For months, he'd battled doubts, assumptions, and barriers, and now he was finally seen for his true potential. Capable, determined, worthy. He glanced back at Mara, seated quietly, hands clasped tight, tears glistening in her eyes. She gave him a small nod, her pride and relief palpable, fueling his purpose anew. Judge Voss leaned forward, eyes locked on Cale. You've taught us all something today, Mr. Draven, he said solemnly. Not just about the law, but about resilience and integrity. Your work here is exceptional, and I hope this is just the start of your path. Cale met the judge's gaze, his voice steady but humble. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll carry this lesson with me. The judge's lips curved into a faint smile. You've earned this victory, son, and I suspect you'll earn many more. Cale stood silent, heart pounding, as Judge Voss raised his gavel and addressed the room. The court rules in favor of the defendant, Mara Draven, he declared firmly. The eviction notice is invalid. The plaintiff must compensate the Draven family for wrongful eviction and emotional distress. The courtroom paused, then erupted into quiet murmurs and scattered applause. Mara gasped, covering her face as tears flowed. She stood and rushed to Cale, wrapping him in a tight embrace. You did it, she whispered through sobs. You really did it. You're my pride, my hope, my everything. Cale hugged her back, eyes glistening but steady. We did it, Mom, he said softly. This victory is ours. As the courtroom emptied, Judge Voss stepped down from the bench and approached Cale and Mara, his expression thoughtful, blending humility and admiration. Mr. Draven, he said, extending a hand. I owe you an apology. Cale blinked, surprised, but shook the judge's hand firmly. When you first walked in, Voss continued, his voice steady but tinged with regret, I assumed you didn't belong here. I let my biases cloud my judgment. But today, you've shown me justice doesn't care about age, race, or background. It cares about truth and courage, and you've displayed both in spades. Cale nodded, voice quiet but firm. Thank you, Your Honor. That means a lot. Voss smiled faintly, resting a hand on Cale's shoulder. You've got a rare gift, son. If you're serious about law, I'd be honored to mentor you. This field needs people like you. Mara placed a hand over her heart, gratitude and pride in her eyes. Thank you, she said softly, barely above a whisper. As Kale and Mara stepped out of the courthouse, the warm midday sun bathed them in light. The trial's burden lifted, replaced by hope and possibility. Kale paused at the step's top, gazing at the clear sky. "One day, I'll come back," he murmured, voice low but resolute. "Not as a defendant, but as a lawyer. I'll fight for people like us." Mara turned to him, her smile radiant despite tear-streaked cheeks. "You'll do it, Kale," she said with quiet certainty. "I know you will." Together, they walked home, their steps lighter than they'd been in months. The modest house they'd fought to keep stood waiting, its door swinging open to welcome them. Kale glanced back at the courthouse one last time, his face calm but determined. His journey had just begun. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey of resilience, hope, and justice. If Kale's story moved you as much as it moved us, don't keep it to yourself. Like this video to show your support, share it with friends and family. You never know whose day it might lift, and subscribe to our channel, hitting the notification bell so you never miss another powerful tale like this. Your support means everything to us. Every like, share, and subscription fuels our team to keep creating content that touches hearts and sparks change. Thanks for being part of our community. See you in the next story.